Welcome back to the second session this afternoon of the Mind, Soul, World, Consciousness in Nature colloquium. And having just come back from Europe and with a quite severe jet lag in my system, I have the issue in my body, as it were. I'm trying to keep mind, soul, and nature together as best as I can. If I start to sound a little bit odd, you will know why. I'm Gretchen Reydams-Schils. I'm professor of ancient philosophy and chairperson in the program of liberal studies, and I have concurrent appointments in classics, philosophy, and theology. And I have a bit of a horse in this race as well, because I have worked, among other things, on the relationship between Plato's notion of the world soul and the human soul. This afternoon session is called Intentionality and the Transcendent Ends of Consciousness. Of course, before we start a session like that, it's very important to thank the sponsors, the people who made this possible. And in particular, we would like to express our deepest gratitude to the John Templeton Foundation, without whom this colloquium would not have been possible. Now, for those of you who are here, you have access to the biographies, either online or in paper copies, but we are joined by listeners from all over the world. And so for their sake, I'm going to take a few minutes to say a little bit more about the colloquium itself, and then also about our speakers this afternoon. The colloquium itself was conceived by Professor David Bentley Hart, who is our pièce de résistance, and we thought about putting him on the centerpiece in the middle of the room, but then, given that he wants to take part in the discussion, we decided not to do that. He is one of this year's Templeton Fellows at the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study. And this is very much an interdisciplinary approach to the issue, the critical topics about consciousness, including whether consciousness can evolve or emerge from matter, about intentionality and the transcendental ends of consciousness, and obviously our panel now will focus on that topic, classical metaphysics of the soul, Eastern contributions to the understanding of consciousness, and the soul and the whole being. The purpose is to bring many people from many different angles into this conversation, and indeed to leave room for divergent perspectives. This afternoon's session will have two parts. First, we'll have our two presenters, John Betz and David C. Schindler. They will present their thoughts on the topic that has been assigned to them. And then David Hart himself will have the first response before we open it up to questions from the audience, as well as questions that may be coming in online. And I'm told that at some point I will be handed an iPad to handle those questions, but I think what the conference organizers don't necessarily realize is what a Luddite I am, and that I've never in my life worked with an iPad. But I'll do my best to keep the audience that is not in the room with us in the discussion. So John Betz is Associate Professor of Systematic Theology at the University of Notre Dame. He specializes in systematic and philosophical theology. He is the author of After Enlightenment, The Post-Secular Vision of J.G. Hammond, and numerous book chapters and articles in journals such as Modern Theology and the Journal of the History of Ideas. He is also the co-editor of an English edition of the 20th century Jesuit philosopher and theologian Eric Shevara's classic work, Analogia Entis, and that he did together with David Hart in 2014. His current project is a monograph on Shevara, part of a larger project to recover the relevance of 20th century Christian metaphysics for theology today. David C. Schindler is Associate Professor of Metaphysics and Anthropology at the John Paul II Institute in Washington, D.C. He is the author of Hans Urs von Balthasar and the Dramatic Structure of Truth, a Philosophical Investigation, Plato's Critique of Impure Reason on Truth and Goodness in the Republic, The Perfection of Freedom, Schiller, Schelling, and Hegel between the Ancients and the Moderns, and The Catholicity of Reason. He's currently finishing a translation of Ferdinand Ulrich's Homo Abyssus, and working on a primer in philosophical anthropology founded on the transcendental properties of being. Since 2002, Professor Schindler has served as an editor of Communio, International Catholic Review. Finally, last but not least, David Hart is the recent holder of the Danforth Chair at St. Louis University and currently serves as a Templeton Fellow at the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study. He specializes in philosophical theology, systematics, patristics, classical and continental philosophy, and ancient Asian religion. His most recent work focuses on the genealogy of classical and Christian metaphysics, ontology, the metaphysics of the soul, and the philosophy of mind. The author of many books and more than 150 articles, so you'll be happy that we won't list all of his books. His most recent works include The Beauty of the Infinite, The Doors of the Sea, In the Aftermath, Atheist Delusions, and The Experience of God. In addition to his many prestigious fellowships and awards, in 2011, Professor Hart was awarded the Michael Ramsey Prize of the Church of England. Please join me in extending a very warm welcome to our speakers for the second session this afternoon, John Betz, David C. Schindler, and David Hart.
Thank you, Gretchen. It's a privilege to be part of this conversation and have similar questions recycle through and get a chance to deepen and be revisited from different perspectives. That's not something that happens often in conferences. I want to thank David for the invitation and the Templeton Foundation for making it possible, and for to everyone here for participating. As the epigraph to his Hyperion, the German poet Hölderlin presents what is typically taken to be the Grabschrift of St. Ignatius. It turns out that's erroneous, but in any event, the saying I think we can take as representing a certain Ignatian motto. And the line runs thus: Non coercere maximo, tamen continere minimo divinum est. Roughly translated, the divine is that which exceeds even what is greatest, and yet may be contained within the limits of what is smallest. And I want to, that phrase, I'd like to, it's going to be kind of a refrain. I'd like to keep that as the horizon for my comments. I'd like to suggest that this captures not just the essential nature of divinity, as Hölderlin, as the saying itself puts it, but also in a certain sense captures the essential nature of spirit, simply, including human spirit. So I'll actually begin with my conclusion, just to make everything very clear. The gist of what I'm going to propose here is that while it is true, as David has put it, that nature has its place in mind, as he inverted the terms of the project, it seems to me it's also the case that the mind, in a very particular way, has its proper place in nature, and in a certain sense within the bounds of nature. So I'm going to try to interpret that by suggesting that mind actually desires to be embraced within a nature that in a certain respect exceeds it. So in other words, it's not only the case that matter loves spirit, if I can put it that way, but it's also the case that spirit loves matter. And in the former principle, matter loves spirit, is something that's common, I think, in classical Greek philosophy. It's a certain sense a paraphrase of Aristotle's principle that matter desires form, he says, in the way that the female desires the male and the ugly the beautiful. A strange observation. But it seems to me that the former or the latter principle, that spirit loves matter, is not something that's obvious. in classical Greek thought. But I do think, for reasons that aren't hard to guess, it is, or at least it ought to be, evident in the Christian appropriation of Greek thought. So in the following, I want to engage with David's text in the light of the Ignatian motto. And I'll be focusing most directly, the topic was intentionality and the transcendent ends of consciousness. I'm not going to be talking so much about intentionality, mostly focused on the transcendent ends of consciousness, or as David put it in the text, the vocation of the mind to absolute ends. That will be the focus of my observations. So to begin, I want first to recognize the importance of David's description of the intellect as essentially aspiring to being as such, as a whole. It's a principle that we don't hear sufficiently often, I think, these days. What it implies is that reason has a certain essential correlation to being. It's in a certain sense the proper other to being, and vice versa. If we affirm that reason does have that essential ordination to being, it seems to me that this aspiration gives the intellect an essentially analogical structure. If being is essentially analogical, meaning in one of the implications of which is that being is always, in a certain sense, out beyond itself, it seems to me that reason, in its relationship to being, in a way, imitates that. And it's the very nature of reason to be, in some sense, beyond itself. And I'll try to explain what I mean by that as we continue. In the present context, this means most directly that the mind grasps its object in its being, in the object's being, and as a whole, only insofar as it also in some respect transcends it. This is a point that David, I think, very beautifully and succinctly affirmed in his text. One passage, for instance, he says that consciousness contains nature as a complete and cogent reality because it has always gone beyond nature. So the point is that reason achieves completion and perfection only insofar as it transcends that limit, as it were, so that those transcendence and completion are coextensive. This breaks into the sort of dilemma that we typically have between openness and closure. Totality and infinity in Levinas, that's a false dichotomy. You can't ever have a real completeness, a totality, except by being open to the infinite. Now, this aspiration to being as such means that the mind can grasp created being as a whole only in its assent to God. Again, beautifully affirmed by David. God as ipsum esse subsistens, who is infinitely different from created being. And I think something similar can be said for all of the transcendental properties. It can't be developed here, but it seems to me that this analogical principle doesn't even end in the eschaton, that the beatific vision in which the mind is perfectly united to the divine essence, that too ought to be interpreted analogically, which I think can only happen in a Trinitarian key. We recognize that we can only, in a certain sense, understand any one person of the Trinity in relation to the infinitely different other persons. So our very entry into the vision of God is an entry into Trinitarian difference. There's a certain sense in which the Trinitarian understanding of God implies that God, as Balthasar says, in a certain sense is essentially even infinitely beyond himself. God is the essentially ever greater. But let's set that point aside for a moment. Another point from David's text that I want to affirm as crucially important, and again beautifully put, is his affirmation that the mind is not just passive in its consciousness. It's not just a mere receptacle in its consciousness, but it's aspirational. If I may just quote a text from him here, the world, he says, is intelligible to us because we reach out towards it or reach beyond it. In fact, both of those. Coming to know the endless diversity of particular things within the embrace of a more general and abstract yearning for a knowledge of truth as such, and by way of an aboriginal inclination of the mind towards reality as a comprehensible whole. Knowledge is born out of a natural longing for the ideal intelligibility of all things, a final infinite horizon of knowledge that is nothing less than the whole of being. Even our most ordinary acts of cognition organize and take hold of the world because the intellect has a certain natural compulsion that exceeds the individual objects of awareness. That's, I think, just an excellent summary statement of this point that the mind, in a way, has to, it's within its desire for God and this movement out of itself, that desire implies that it's able to achieve its own even natural ends in any particular act of consciousness. It's crucial to recognize that this dynamic movement of the mind, to use his word, is part of the mind's intelligence and not simply a part of its eros, its appetite. That's a very common affirmation, but I think it's true, as David says, that it's part of its intelligence. The very understanding it has a kind of an ecstatic dimension. Earlier today, it was raised whether David would address the phenomenological accounts of consciousness, and it seems to me that this insight that he has here actually introduces a helpful corrective to typical phenomenological understandings, a Husserlian understanding of consciousness, which is very much a sort of a passive recipient. The acts of intentionality have an active dimension, but intelligence itself is understood as in a purely theoretical vein, and without this aspirational notion of intentionality in the way that David uses the term. Okay, all of those things being said, and against the background of these points from David's paper that I affirm, I'd like to propose a complementary line of reflection. And I want to clarify, I don't mean this as a corrective, but genuinely as a complementary line of reflection. I don't see what I'm going to present here as something that David is denying. But I think it's implicit and ought to be brought out. I suppose if he does go on to deny it, then yes, this is a corrective, or intends to be a corrective. But I think that especially given his comments to earlier questions, that this is not something he's rejecting. Now, given that, so what is the complementary line? Given that the mind arrives at its proper end only by exceeding it, I want to suggest that there is a natural analog to this extra-natural ecstasis, this reaching out beyond nature. Or to put it in other words, it seems to me that there's a kind of a horizontal ecstasis that is analogous to the vertical ecstasis that Hart describes. And it's ultimately, I want to suggest, a necessary correlate to that sort of transcendence. And this natural analog, this horizontal ecstasis that coincides in a way with a vertical transcendence, seems to me that we're approaching the Ignatian motto that I mentioned at the outset. So I want to call that again to mind. Let me specify. So what does all this mean? It's not only God, ipsum esse subsistens, that exceeds the mind. Perhaps surprisingly, according to Aquinas, it's also each and every material singular that exceeds the mind, Aquinas says. Now, according to Aquinas, the reason that material singulars exceed the mind, there's something that the mind can't directly and, in a certain sense, comprehensively grasp. It's not because of their singularity, but specifically because of their materiality. Matter as such cannot enter into the mind. into the human mind specifically. Now, one response to this, which I take to be a true observation, one response to this perennial problem is to dismiss matter as a kind of absurd, to remove it as far as possible from the horizon of significance. But it seems to me that the principle that we were just talking about, this ecstasis, this analogical nature of reason, actually introduces an alternative way to understand matter's recalcitrance to intelligence. If you can, I don't mean that in a negative sense, as I'll explain. So what is the alternative? It is that a recognition that that which exceeds the mind can be interpreted as a positive principle of intelligibility. In knowing material singulars, the object of the act, in every knowing of a material singular, the object of the act, paradoxically, exceeds the act. And it's the very excess that allows the act to come to completion. So there's a certain sense in which every single concrete, real being represents a kind of absolute end, a kind of absolute being. It's not just God. There's something analogously absolute, if you will, about every existing thing. As a side note, it seems to me that this point that I'm making here sets into relief a possible problem with Scotus's notion of hechetas, which attempts to make a formal principle. Hechetas for Scotus is what we might call a formal principle of uniqueness that in its formality is intelligible. But the problem with that is that in making a formal principle, in making uniqueness a formal principle that is therefore intelligible to the mind, you precisely deprive the non-formal or perhaps supra-formal principle that causes a thing's intelligibility in its uniqueness, this very excess of the mind that I've been talking about. Now, this is all very abstract. I'm going to try to get it a little more concrete as I go here. The first way I'd like to try to do that is to introduce a name that's come up surprisingly to me. I wasn't expecting this, but a name that's come up many times, and that's Michael Polanyi in his epistemology. As Polanyi affirms, as many of you know, in every single act of knowledge, he says, we always know more than we can say. And what he means by that is that intelligibility exceeds, it can't be circumscribed by the conceptual. There's something beyond the conceptual that's part of intelligibility itself. And that's the case for every single act of knowledge. And one of the ways that Polanyi explains that is by speaking of a kind of an indwelling of objects that occurs when we understand them. He says that we indwell an object that then becomes the perspective from which we're able. It's a kind of a recognition of a whole that becomes in a way, unconscious or non-thematic horizon in relation to which we're able to grasp any particular part. And I'd like to sort of connect Polanyi and Aquinas here by thinking of this excess of the mind and knowing material singulars as a form of an indwelling that sets into relief the conceptual dimension of things. Now, to try to make this, that's not so concrete yet, I imagine, but to try to make it even a bit more concrete. Aquinas says that the soul is united to the body, as many of you know, not for the body's sake, but for the soul's sake. It seems to me it's not inappropriate to say that the soul has a natural love for the body, in fact, for its body. Aquinas says that the soul gives the body its own existence, and gives it so radically that the soul and the body can share a single existence together. I think we can think of that gift of existence to the body from the soul as an expression of the natural love of the soul, a desire in a certain sense for the body. Now, I want to suggest that this natural love that the soul has for the body comes to expression in the soul's proper operations. So not just in the body-soul unity, but in every act of the soul in intellect and will. That is to say, by extension, that the ordination to absolute truth and goodness that occurs in the intellect and the will, as David affirmed, tends naturally to be also an ordination to truth and goodness in some incarnate form. In other words, the soul reaches out both, and indeed simultaneously, to truth and goodness as transcendental properties, i.e. as absolute, and in concrete, finite reality. So the spirit is ecstatic, reaching out beyond itself, in some sense, beyond its capacities in both cases. Although this transcendence, I don't mean to identify them. Our intentional, to put it another way, our intentional acts seek not just to comprehend, but at the same time to be comprehended, to be, as it were, enfolded within and carried by a reality that is greater than the act. Now, this horizontal transcendence has implications in both the intellectual and the volitional orders, and I'd like to present two examples of each to, again, make a little more concrete what I'm saying. So first of all, in the intellectual order, it seems to me that we all recognize we experience a profound satisfaction in the contemplation of what Kant called an aesthetic idea, or in any event, in the incarnation of thought in the imagination, in a story or a drama, the significance of which seems inexhaustible. We don't, when we see a character presenting some idea and we know that we can articulate some aspect of the idea, but we also have the experience that what we're articulating about that, the meaning of a character or a figure or an event in a story, we know that it's more than we can quite put into words. We don't experience that as a frustration. Sometimes maybe we do, but it seems to me that essentially that's experienced as satisfying. There's something we're seeing the truth of it more clearly, even in that excess of our conceptuality. Likewise, a second example of this in the intellectual order is, it seems to me, in the simple act of contemplating any really existing thing. One can look at a tree, for instance, for forever, for a long time, without getting bored. And what's going on there? I mean, it seems to me that that wouldn't be possible if we, in knowing it, we had everything that there was to know about the tree and we were finished. Then it would be pointless to continue. Given that fact, people will often say, well, what you're contemplating, in fact, is God in the tree. And I want to say, yes, that's true, but it's not just God in the tree. There's something about the reality of the tree itself that evokes the same kind of mysterious presence of something beyond our grasp as a positive principle of intelligibility. Okay, in the volitional order, there are a couple of examples I'd like to propose. First is the phenomenon of affection. It seems to me evident that we desire not just one thing after another as objects of discrete acts of will inside of a desire for absolute goodness, but instead we desire a kind of abiding attachment to particular things which exceeds any discrete act, or even the serial accumulation of acts. And it seems to me that this is what affection essentially is. Typically, we think of affection as a psychological state. It's a sort of a feeling that grows inside of us. But I want to give it a strong ontological reason account. That in fact, affection happens because our soul is always out beyond itself. And just as it has a natural inclination to take root in the body, so too in its acts that exceed the body, the vision out into the world, these two have a tendency to take root in things, to settle into things. And that's what affection essentially is. The other example is, in a certain sense, the most complete and perfect form of this kind of attachment, in which the will, understood as a dimension of the human spirit, has a natural aspiration, again, not only to the universal good in its absoluteness, but specifically to the profession of a vow, the establishment of a permanent public bond. And specifically a limited, there's a sense in which the will absolutely limits itself in professing a bond, an exclusive bond, but that's not, that's a completion of the will in its desire for transcendence and not a contradiction of it, which it might seem to be if you thought only in this, in the sense of the will striving after the absolute. Okay, I said that I'm almost finished here, just one last section. I said that this proposal complements David's insistence on the extra natural ends of human spirit. I suppose what we could call what I've been describing the spirit's intra-natural end, which again also exceeds spirit as such, though in a different way. In another context, one could show the dependence of the intra-natural on the extra-natural, or in other words, one could show that it is only in the aspiration towards, and in a certain sense, the givenness of absolute truth, beauty, and goodness, that we are even capable of acts of contemplative indwelling, the incarnate phenomenon of imagination, the achievement of genuine affection, and the entrance into a permanent bond. But here, in conclusion, I want to make 3 comments regarding the converse dependence, which I think is more often missed. First, if we do not affirm the horizontal analogy of the intranatural, the desire for the boundaries of finitude to be embodied, to be enclosed within what occupies the determinate limits of space and time, our interpretation of spirit will tend to collapse into an ultimately subjective form, I think. It won't contain nature at all in the end, but instead tend to flee from it, to be driven to transgress all limitation, only finally to be trapped, as it were, within its own infinity. The lack of all limitation turns out in the end to be a pseudo-infinity, a gaping void. Second, without a horizontal analog to the ecstasis that brings about completeness, it would be difficult to avoid falling into precisely what David says he intends to resist in his account, namely interpreting the transcendental in a Kantian sense. And eventually, I think you could say a transcendental Thomist sense. He doesn't raise that issue himself. In which the transcendental means an exclusively a priori condition of possibility. That means lacking any a posteriori dimensions. So I think this intranatural analog is necessary to avoid Kant, to put it simply. Finally, it may turn out that recognizing this horizontal analog ends up complexifying the identity of being and consciousness that David refers to repeatedly. It seems to me that while there must be an absolute simplicity to the ultimate relation between being and consciousness, to the extent that they do indeed, in some sense, turn into each other, as it were, at the same time, one ought to resist assuming that this implies a pure transparency and nothing else. To the contrary, it seems to me that the principle of analogy requires us to recognize that in this identity of being and consciousness, mystery of some form remains. And I think analogously even in God, but that's obviously a controverted point. In the end, the Ignatian motto cited at the outset represents a profound description of the nature, not just of the divine, but of the mind simply, of the human spirit in all of its mysterious depth. Non coercere maximo tamen continere minimo, hoc spiritus est. Human spirit exceeds human being. It's always outside of itself, so non coercere maximo. But in this excess, it always tends to attach itself, to take root in the world in a manner analogous to the soul's rooting itself in the body. Contenere minimo. Thank you.
Thanks, David. I think our talks are remarkably complementary. Not that we intended to be that way. I didn't have a chance to read David's talk before I wrote mine, but we seem to be saying very similar things. So thank you. It's an honor to be here among so many esteemed teachers, colleagues, and students and friends who have shaped my thinking in so many ways. So, the impossibly big question that David asked me to address today in the space of 30 minutes is this: can rational spirit be anything but an infinite desire for God? Knowing David's love for Gregory of Nyssa, when he first asked me this, I could not help but take this as a rhetorical question. Of course, in addressing this question, I won't take the answer for granted. Even so, I should say I'm inclined to agree with him and to say no, that rational spirit, insofar as it is rational, cannot be anything other. But how could this be? How could rational spirit be an infinite desire for God when we know that, practically speaking, few people seem to have it? For if we really are rational spirits, we seem perfectly capable of satisfying ourselves with much less than the infinite. Perhaps a new house, a good spouse, or maybe just a flat-screen television. Indeed, if we are talking not in the abstract, but about real human beings, the proposition would seem extravagantly romantic, as if every one of us was running around looking for that blue flower. But quite seriously, when we look within ourselves, do we really find such a desire? The kind of desire that might be described in terms of the words of Christ from John's Gospel as a fountain of living water welling up to eternal life. My initial response to David's question, then, is a practical one. And as I hope to show, any attempt to answer demands that the question be specified in this way. And any attempt to answer it demands that the question be specified in this way, lest we be talking in the abstract about rational spirits other than human spirits, and end up with answers that are neither practically nor even metaphysically convincing. Before going any further, though, I can't fail to mention the great 20th century Jesuit, Henri de Lubac. For if I'm not mistaken, I think it is safe to see in David's question a veiled affirmation of de Lubac's famous thesis of the natural desire for the supernatural, which I'm also inclined to affirm. Indeed, in some ways, this entire paper could be about de Lubac, about whom many in this room, like John Milbank, are more competent to speak than I. So in the time that remains, I will be directly addressing David's concerns and indirectly those of de Lubac's, all in an attempt to affirm two basic things. Firstly, that rational spirit, as the image of God, is essentially oriented to transcendence. And secondly, that the more rational spirit becomes what it is, i.e., the more it accords with its essence, the more desirable God becomes. But I'm getting ahead of myself because I'm already using explicitly theological and metaphysical categories. I'm already speaking of the essence of the rational spirit and drawing upon biblical anthropology to justify using such metaphysical terms. Not that this in itself is problematic. As Barth would remind us, one should never have to apologize for beginning with revelation. But following Catholic tradition, without taking anything away from the priority of revelation, the more one believes in revelation, the more one will wish to sketch out a reasonable path to it, precisely out of charity toward those who do not believe, as an offering of a way to believe. Indeed, if it were necessary to justify the task of apologetics, though I don't really think that it is, one would have to do no more than observe that it is not a foundational activity, in the sense that Barth was so concerned to avoid, but an incarnational activity, which follows in the way of Christ himself, who ascends only by first descending, accommodating himself to the place, time, and mode of being of his hearers. Accordingly, in keeping with the general topic of our session, the path I wish to sketch out here is one that begins with what is familiar to all rational persons, namely consciousness, and which then proceeds from a brief phenomenology of consciousness to a metaphysics of consciousness, and therewith to the threshold, which only faith can cross over, of Trinitarian metaphysics. In short, the path is one that leads from phenomenology to metaphysics to theology, whereby the only real question is the modality of the progression and the extent of one's intellectual freedom to deny it, whether, that is, each stage leads with a real necessity according to internal demands or merely with an internal consistency to the next. I begin then with consciousness, more particularly with the remarkable fact, which was first thematized by Franz Brentano and subsequently elaborated by Husserl, of its intentional structure. In other words, what we discover is that consciousness cannot be reduced to a flowing series of moods, states, or feelings, to a passive being carried along, but is defined by particular acts of intention, about which we've already heard quite a bit. In short, it is oriented to things, whether these things be mental or physical, initially bracketing the question of their reality. And I take this to be a genuine advance in the history of philosophy. Firstly, because it successfully resisted the threat of philosophy's reduction to psychology. Secondly, because for the first time in centuries, it enabled philosophy to go beyond the immanent confines of the Cartesian subject and the strictures of Kantian idealism, and beyond too, therefore, the attempts to overcome idealism with idealism on the part of the German idealists. And thirdly, centuries after Descartes' radical break with it, it suddenly made possible for modern philosophy to have a genuine conversation with scholasticism, as happened perhaps most notably in the work of Edith Stein. At the instigation of her friend Erich Shivara, who was himself at the forefront of the conversation between phenomenology and theology, Stein had begun serious study of Thomas Aquinas. And in 1929, she was bold and creative enough to submit a dialogue for Husserl's Festschrift, the first of them, which featured an imaginary conversation between Husserl and the Dominican, who appears in Husserl's study at a late hour in a white habit. The editor of the Festschrift, however, who was not humored by the submission, deemed it unsuitably academic, and so she had to resubmit it in a more prosaic form. And can you guess who the editor was? It was Husserl's other assistant, Martin Heidegger. Now, the reason why this is so important is that Stein was able to draw a connection between the intentionality of consciousness and what we would call at its immanently transcendent orientation to the transcendentals themselves, to being, truth, goodness, oneness, beauty. And by immanently, I mean that according to phenomenology's own terms, the extramental reality of the objects of consciousness is still undetermined. As she has Thomas say in her dialogue, speaking of natural reason, it heads straight for its goal, the full truth, which as a regulative idea sets the course it is to take. Its way is endless. Admittedly, at this point in the dialogue, the transcendentals still function as regulative ideas, but inasmuch as they glimmer within consciousness, drawing it beyond itself, as it were, the way is now cleared to understand them in objective terms, such that the mind is ordered to truth, the will is ordered to goodness, and so forth. Indeed, one could argue that for the early Husserl, there is little more than a thin methodological veil separating immanent objects of consciousness from their transcendent extramental reality. To be sure, a strict phenomenologist may feel compelled to remain this side of the veil, indifferent to what lies on the other side of it, indifferent to the reality of what appears, Such is the residual idealism, and I am tempted to say misguided asceticism, that continues to exert its influence within phenomenology. And I say misguided because genuine asceticism is always at the service of religion, not an excuse to disregard its claims. But the veil nevertheless appears and beckons, inviting one to draw it to the side and enter in, and thereby to pass from phenomenology to metaphysics. Of course, there are other ways to crack open the cogito, as it were, and conduct thought beyond itself toward the transcendent. And in this regard, one can't help but think of the remarkable work of Maurice Blondel, or even someone like Levinas, though oddly enough, he sees intentionality as an ethical problem and an obstacle to genuine otherness. The way I wish to focus on here, however, is that of, it won't be a real surprise to many of you, Erich Shivara, and for two reasons. Firstly, because writing several decades after Blondel, he was at the forefront of the theological reception of phenomenology and worked precisely at the intersection of phenomenology and metaphysics. And secondly, because one of my colleagues, whose opinion I greatly value, convinced me when I was about to drop him to go ahead and do so. Not drop him, in other words. So what then is Shivara's way? How does he break through the security system, as it were, of modern Cartesian consciousness? and even the attempts of German idealism to overcome the limitations of modern subjectivity by what we might call its hyperextension, by, that is, including all objectivity within it. Like Blondel, his approach is in some ways a tour de force, at least in its overall effect. But in other ways, it is surprisingly modest. For as he sets out, he aims simply to demonstrate the tensions, the Spannungen, internal to thought qua thought, and to philosophy qua philosophy, such as those between idealism and realism, truth and history, transcendentalism and hermeneutics, all of which he takes to be manifestations of a still more basic ontological tension between essence and existence. Thus, the Thomistic metaphysics of the real distinction turns out to be a hermeneutical key to deciphering the fluctuations of the history of ideas, most obviously in view of the various essentialisms and existentialisms. In the order of knowledge, however, the original tension is that between being and consciousness, and this is why Shivara's metaphysics is not simply a reprise of Thomism, but one that is fully attuned to the concerns of modernity and modern epistemology. As he programmatically puts it in his 1926 work, Religionsphilosophie katholischer Theologie, which is the precursor to his 1932 magnum opus, the Analogia Entis, all genuine philosophical reflection occurs within the indissoluble tension of consciousness between its self-enclosure, immanence, and its essential orientation to being, which is independent of consciousness, transcendence. From this starting point, he then proceeds to develop a fundamental typology of various orientations of consciousness, each of which corresponds to a basic type of philosophy of religion. Among the basic types he identifies are those characterized by immanence, one thinks here of Schleiermacher, by transcendence, he gives the example of deism, or by what he calls transcendentality, and here he thinks of Kant or someone like Hermann Cohn, for whom the transcendent as an idea is the essential goal of our striving in infinitum. The result, though, is that none of these types is really pure, and so it turns out neither is consciousness. Rather, all of these types are characterized by a rhythmic, quasi-musical interplay of one into the other, which brings to light what Shivara calls a structural principle of oscillation, which, it turns out, is precisely what he means by analogy. And by that, he means a structural principle of oscillation between immanence and transcendence. That is how he understands analogy. For to put it very simply, risking oversimplification, to say that one thing is reflected in another thing but not identical to it is in one sense to say that it is in that thing, and in another sense to say that it is beyond it. In any case, to say analogia entis is for Shivara much more than good Catholic grammar. It is more even than a figure for how to speak properly about the difference between divine and creaturely being. At its deepest level, it is philosophical shorthand for two kinds of oscillation. Firstly, for lack of a better word, and here I'm going to use the word horizontal that David used earlier, a horizontal oscillation of polarities immanent to creaturely being, which itself is a tension between being and consciousness. And secondly, a vertical oscillation between divine immanence and divine transcendence, such that God is not only immanent to creation, nor only transcendent of creation, but, to use the idiom Shivara will deploy from now on, simultaneously in and beyond creation. Thus, with its horizontal and vertical aspects, the Analogia Entis turns out to have a cruciform structure. Whether this is especially significant or just a curiosity is another question. Such, in an event, is the basic Catholic understanding of the relationship between God and world for Shivara. An understanding that he opposes on the one hand to all philosophies that would reduce God to the world, all forms of pantheism that is, and on the other hand all theologies such as the dialectical theology of the early Barth that in the name of divine otherness and the totally alienative effects of the fall would strictly oppose them. But what, more precisely, does this mean for consciousness? In view of these horizontal and vertical dynamics and the structural principle of oscillation or analogy that Shivara takes them to imply, it means that consciousness can never be closed in upon itself without denying what it is. On the contrary, consciousness points inexorably beyond itself, both outward in its intentionality and upward on account of the openness of its tensions. So much so that for Shivara, the creature is essentially figured in Notre Dame. You all know which Notre Dame. This is an analogy. You know, Notre Dame is always good for explaining analogy to students, right? I mean the primary analogate here. But nota bene, this is not to say that the creature who is existentially affected by sin is existentially open to transcendence. Essential and existential openness are two radically different things. And it was arguably a failure on both sides to be clear about this difference that led to Barth's objection to Shivara's undertaking. Again, though, for Shivara, this does not change the fact that the creature, qua creature, has no fixed point in itself, and as such is metaphysically open to God. Indeed, in this regard, contra every attempt to find in consciousness some kind of Archimedean point from which to move the modern world, he goes so far as to say that consciousness is broken up and even broken upwards. Aufgebrochen sein nach oben, he says. Far then from being self-contained, consciousness refers to God, whether it acknowledge its fundamentally dynamic and inconclusive nature, and therewith its natural referentiality to God, or not. Part 3. Thus we are led from a phenomenology of consciousness to metaphysics, not by necessity, as though we were compelled to do so, but in response to a genuine invitation to thought. And for those who have accepted the invitation and would accept the use of more festive terms, it now becomes plausible to speak not only of consciousness as ordered to metaphysics, but also of a metaphysics of consciousness. By this term, I certainly mean to indicate the transcendent orientation of consciousness, which goes beyond itself in every one of its intentional acts. This is where I began. But I mean something more than this. I also mean to say that consciousness itself has a metaphysical structure. More precisely, that it too is characterized by a dynamic interplay of immanence and transcendence. More specifically, between consciousness as it rests in itself and consciousness as it journeys forth toward a world of intentional objects. In short, to make use of Shivara's shorthand, consciousness is in and beyond itself. But to complete our picture of creaturely being consciousness, another step is required. And at this point, I would prefer to use the hyphenated form being consciousness, inasmuch as human being is fundamentally an interplay of being and consciousness, such that to be most precise, one really has to speak not in terms of discrete realities of being and consciousness, but in terms of the being of consciousness and the consciousness of being, with those emphases. Now, to reiterate the basic moves thus far, we have seen how, for Shivara, the world in its entirety is an analogy of God, who is in and beyond it. This is the most basic in and beyond, which is to say the most basic analogical structure. And we have seen that consciousness, too, as one aspect of the creaturely analog, is characterized by its own immanent in and beyond structure. Now, to take the next step, we need simply to return our attention to the other aspect of the creaturely analog, its being, and take note of the fact that for Shivara, creaturely being, far from having any stable point in itself, is likewise constituted by an in and beyond structure, specifically by a creaturely essence that is ever in and beyond existence, to use his formula. And this is the core, I take it, of his innovation of the Thomistic real distinction. Thus we come to the remarkable conclusion that creaturely being, like creaturely consciousness, is in and beyond itself. Indeed, just as consciousness is stretched between the being of consciousness and the consciousness of being, being itself is stretched between its existing essence and the horizon of its essence, as that to which it is ever underway. We thus have here, whether he intended it to be such or not, a full-scale metaphysics of epectasis. For just as creaturely consciousness is a stretch, so too is creaturely being. Now, forgive me if I'm making you dizzy with all these in and beyonds, so let me try to sum all of this up. Creaturely being is immanently in and beyond itself, as essence in and beyond existence. Creaturely consciousness is likewise in and beyond itself, in its resting in itself and its going forth to being. And then there is an internal analogy between them, so that the creaturely being consciousness is, even immanently, an analogy in itself. And then, finally, because this immanent creaturely analogy, which is the world as we know it, is inexplicable on its own terms, for Shivara it points metaphysically beyond itself to a divine mystery that is at once in it as its cause and beyond it. That is, to a primary analogate in which we might now speculate, in which being and consciousness are one. Thus, beginning from a phenomenology of consciousness, we pass by way of metaphysics and a metaphysics of consciousness to the threshold of theology proper, where reason alone, unenlightened by faith, can go no farther. We stand now, as it were, before the doors of the temple. But the moment that in faith we pass over the threshold into the realm of Trinitarian theology, the correspondences between the life of the Trinity and the life of consciousness should startle us. For what we find is that the life of the Trinity, so far as this is known to us, could likewise be described as a dynamic interplay of immanence and transcendence. Or rather, we should say, not by inference, but in light of revelation, the Trinity is the archetype of all such dynamics, and the archetype, too, of all metaphysics. For who is the Father but the one who goes beyond himself, metaphysically, in the Son? And can we not say something similar of all the persons of the Trinity, each of whom goes forth in love toward the other? Could we not say that the Trinity is essentially a dynamic and creatively fruitful interplay of divine persons, whereby each person is in and beyond the other, this being the condition for the possibility of love? And could we not say that we ourselves are created to this end, namely, like the Trinity, to live beyond ourselves and so find ourselves in love? But herein lies the major dissimilitudo and the distance of the analogy between God and us. Whereas natural consciousness continually goes forth in intentionality only to return ever again to itself, the persons of the Trinity eternally go forth only to find themselves in the other. In other words, in them, in love, transcendence and immanence are one. In them, more so than in any disciple or saint, the logion from the Gospels fulfilled, he who would lose his life for my sake will find it. For in them, this kenotic losing oneself in order to find oneself is not something that happens intermittently. Rather, it is an eternal actuality. In them, the going forth from self is a return to self, for the simple reason that they are who they are in love. Now, finally, in conclusion, from the height of Trinitarian speculation, I return to the question I originally posed and which David gave me to think about. Can rational spirit be anything but an infinite desire for God? Again, I believe I have to say no. By the same token, I feel obliged to affirm de Lubach's thesis of the natural desire for the supernatural. For if the human being is the image of God, who according to Ecclesiastes has set eternity in our hearts, and if human logoi are made by their very natures according to the logos, it seems artificial and indeed oxymoronic to posit any intermediary ends. I mean, what would that mean, really? As though the image of God could be satisfied in anything less than its archetype. But to return to a point I made at the outset, the matter is more complicated than this because, as we know too well, human beings do not always live up to their natures, and rational spirit is not always rational, which is to say that the logoi of creation, which are essentially I have a hyphen here, analogies, with a hyphen after the ana, meaning that indicating the ano, the movement upwards. The logoi of creation, which are essentially analogies, do not always correspond to their logos. Thus, we are confronted with the paradox that due to sin, what is an analogy can fail to be an analogy. But drawing on the venerable verse from Pindar's second Pythian ode, we can also state the mystery in positive terms by saying the image must become what it is. On this view, one could say that de Lubach's thesis is essentially true, but in a fallen world, not necessarily existentially true. Otherwise, everyone would have this desire, but clearly they don't. And if they did, the Thomists would be right to wonder what becomes of grace. So it seems to me that a further qualification and a further paradoxical qualification is in order. It would seem that one has to say that in a fallen world, the desire for the supernatural, which is natural, is elicited by grace. For in a fallen world, no one enters into the depths of his or her nature apart from grace, nor apart from grace can one possibly clear away enough sediment to discover deep within, in that region that the mystics describe as the spirit or the heart, that natural desire for God, which is like a spring welling up to eternal life. Which brings me finally to the question of the infinity of this desire. To speak thus is certainly to up the ante, because it is to speak the language of the saints, for whom it is natural. But, and I think this is the necessary qualification needed in order to affirm David's thesis, it is natural to them only because their natures have been fulfilled, because in Christ they have become the persons they were created to be. Such as these have found the treasure hidden in a field, the pearl of great price. For them, the desire for God has not only been enkindled, but become insatiable. In this regard, with regard to divine infinity, now I conclude, it is typical to refer to Gregory of Nyssa, and understandably so. He is the theologian of divine infinity par excellence, which is part of the reason why the author of The Beauty of the Infinite likes him so much, I think. But as much as I'd like to quote lengthy passages from the life of Moses or his commentary on the Song of Songs, I don't have an infinite amount of time. And so I will conclude instead with a quote from that other theologian of divine infinity, Augustine, another one of David's friends. There might have been a laugh there, but as he puts it in his wonderful commentary on John, he is hidden in order that you might seek him, and in order that you might not cease in your search once you have found him. He is infinite. Thus it is said, seek his face evermore. Such indeed is the only adequate response for the image of God. So what then are we waiting for? It would seem to be time to get on with it. Thank you.
Thank you for both of those papers. John, you weren't here earlier, but I have the honor of responding to everything up front. But the problem is I don't have that much of a response because, well, for instance, John laid out the program that at least secretly informs my book in a very indiscreet way. But now that it's been done, I'm not sure that I morally I can deny it. Obviously, that's. But it's also opposite to David. I mean, I loved your remarks. I'm not sure I'm entirely on board with that strange invocation of mystery in God. If by it you mean mystery of God to God, then you're getting a bit too German idealist for me. I
would affirm mystery in God only is perfectly coincident with knowledge, though, if that helps.
I'm not subtle enough for that, but okay. It does help, yeah. The only remarks I'll make have to do with where the two papers converge around a common question. In John bringing Shivara into the conversation, and I guess I realize now that he was there all along at a deeper level than I realized after we worked together for a dozen years translating that book. It's a difficult book to translate, and John's very lazy. At the level of the finite, of course, Shivara is quite clear. The dynamism of the analogy allows for no priority in our experience between immanent and transcendent, finite and infinite consciousness and being. Rather, it's the indissoluble oscillations that are the finite expression of that transcendent fullness and unity, and hence the analogical interval in which that which in God is perfect actuality in us is dynamic, synthetic, oscillating. But precisely for that reason the very incompleteness of the knowledge and the very impossibility of the dissolution of this circle into a first moment and a consequent result nonetheless points towards that reality in which the circle subsists, so to speak. And that's the movement from phenomenology to metaphysics, and I mean, what's lovely about Javara is he recognizes it's precisely that in us which defies an immediate identification with the ideal or the essential or existence as such. Is precisely that which points to the necessity of his particular understanding of analogy. Excuse me, I'm not making that very clear. But that raises the question of your final formulation there. Yes, in a fallen world, as a psychological motive, the desire for God can be absent from what, say, Maximus the Confessor would call the gnomic movements of the will. But paradoxically, or not but necessarily, he would still have to affirm that even that sinful wandering must be sustained by the natural orientation of the will, which can never not seek its proper end. And so again, there's the oscillation there. I just don't want to confuse the claim that there's that rational spirit must be an infinite desire for God with the psychological claim that every finite employment of the will is a conscious, intentional movement towards God, and therefore every movement away from God can literally, for a finite creature, be a movement away from God the way we could move away from an object that could be an indifferent end for us, either good or bad as we choose. That it's a more fundamental orientation towards the ontological good that allows for divergence from the true path. So that for Maximus, all the wanderings of the gnomic will are in a desert whose true, who nonetheless a desert that can't ultimately separate the soul naturally from its Canaan. And that, I mean, also touches on David's points. I didn't see anything, I didn't see any way in which I should read the paper as a corrective. I mean, I did see it as complimentary, maybe in reminding me not to sound too much like a German idealist. But again, the Spirit's desire to go forth into the tree as tree I would have to say Spirit loves matter, even can supremely love matter, because the essential primordial desire for the whole of being in its transcendent fullness has to set the finite will free for a measureless diversity of ends. If but otherwise, the practical and prudential form of the act of that primordial desire in a finite creature has to be the art of finite loves, of the poetic labor of receiving the gift of the infinite and offering it back in knowledge and creative acts. So I mean, I don't see a priority here one way or the other. I don't see, and I don't even see a tension there. It's one and the same movement. Describing, I may have put the emphasis on the transcendental ends of consciousness precisely because I'm involved in a certain argument critically at the beginning of the project. But I love what you had to say, and it's a necessary thing to say. But again, even the love for that finite, I mean, I just think that when you look at it, and just be a scrupulous phenomenologist about it, there is that which cannot take it, and you use the term, use the finite thing, take the material, concrete material, as in some sense an absolute end. And you'd sort of have to explain to me what you mean by that, because absolute and concrete don't seem to cohere perfectly well with one another there. But certainly an end that is good in itself, nonetheless, even in the act of desiring that, you realize that it's expressive of a more primordial desire to which the finite desire is always being deferred and thereby being set free. I'm getting more and more obscure the more I talk. What I should do at this point is turn it over to William Desmond, who would then state it all very clearly for it, who he did last time, or someone else. But again, yeah, I'm grateful for both papers, and you don't have to respond to what I said. And I curse John for revealing so much and doing it better than I'd have done. So.
I will try to moderate questions, but I was also told that we've had more than 220 people keying in and listening to what happened today from 17 different countries, so that's quite remarkable. Opening it up to questions. Yes, there in the back.
A question for David Schindler. And I'm going to suggest that the difficulty you have with ekcheitas and Dunscotus. Sorry, I'm going to do this properly. I'm Ed Andreyko, and I'm a fourth-year student in the doctoral program in theology here at Notre Dame. And the question is for David Schindler, and the difficulty that he suggests with Scotus and ekcheitas. What I'm going to suggest is I think that Gerard Manley Hopkins did not have that difficulty, David, although I was trying very hard to piece together what you were saying by that. And it could be, and I simply open this up for further reflection, and your comments, sorry if this is fading on us, in and out here. The reason I think that Hopkins didn't have that difficulty is because he looked at the will not so much as an affection, but that the will was itself oriented towards its object of love, and the intellect was oriented towards its object of truth. And I think I'm going to suggest Hopkins was able to find the balance in that approach of ekcheitas with Scotus. Now, I think there's some further information, and I really don't have it here, but I know that Edith Stein was doing some research on ekcheitas, and I do have a book that just came into my possession, but I'd have to read that to see if there's some linkage there to either strengthen what I'm saying or maybe even bring me a little bit closer to John Betz and on what he was saying about Edith Stein. I don't know if you care to comment on that, David, or not.
Can you hear me? Yes. I had sort of more incidental notes that I didn't read about ekcheitas. I find it a very attractive principle, so I don't mean to reject. I mean, and it's attractive because of the typically Thomism is thought to neglect the material singular, and I was trying to offer a positive way of reading that. But it's popular in a way to reject Thomism and to embrace Scotism on that point because it seems to do more justice to individuality. It seems to make individuality something, if it has a formal principle, it's related more to actuality rather than what seems to be the Thomistic principle that connects individuation with matter and with potency, and therefore, in a certain sense, with the aspect of being that isn't interesting. But in Hopkins, I mean, Hopkins was not a systematic philosopher. And what he celebrated in that principle in Scotus is precisely the recognition of the extraordinary uniqueness of each individually existing thing. But I would suggest that the very point that he is celebrating there is better served by, I'm suggesting this is something I actually would like to think about further, but that insight is better served by acknowledging a supra-formal principle for the uniqueness of being rather than a formal one. Why? A formal, if it's merely formal, it's something that can be taken entirely into the mind, and in a way you no longer have to face the individual being that you are interested in. It's entirely been internalized. And I want to suggest that there's something about its uniqueness that requires you to continue to attend to it. And that's the positive principle of its intelligibility that's beyond that's beyond the conceptual, what's able to be translated into concepts. I mean, ekcheitas becomes a kind of a concept of individuality, and there's a certain confusion of orders that seems to suggest, anyway.
Thank you.
Seth Thomas from. Am I on? There we go. From Brooklyn Christian. Dr. Griffiths brought up a question in an earlier session about phenomenology and just some of the difficulties with earlier phenomenology and the way that they bring up. It's passive, as you were talking about in your paper. This is for either Dr. Hart or Dr. Schindler. I'm wondering how you see Merleau-Ponty fitting in with that, considering that he has more of an active view of things. He talks about bodies that rise toward the world. There's an activity of his mind and body that is not a dualism, but is, not synthesized, but they're one in the way that you're talking about. Just wondering how you see that fit, Dr. Hart, if you've included this in your project at all. That's all.
I mean, for my part, just very briefly, I mean, Merleau-Ponty is I think represents a great development beyond Husserl on that point. But it seems to me you still need to have this element of phenomenology breaking open into metaphysics, even to understand the internal workings of consciousness. But I'll let David.
Well, I agree with that, and that's basically what I'd have said anyway, so I won't repeat it. I could sing a song.
Sorry.
Two questions, one for both and one for John. John gets a theological question, which is number 2. In the movement from immanence to transcendence, clearly both of you want to insist that Catholic thinkers of the 20th century were involved in the correction of Husserl's starting with, but also ending with immanence. So one way of looking at that, of course, is that we've got the realist correction, that the people who read Husserl read Thomas Aquinas and so forth, and that sort of in their reading, one is going to sublimate one. That is, that realism is going to sublimate and take over, sublate, take over the dynamism sort of which tended to be there sort of in the order of immanence. That's one way of reading it. And then, of course, with individual authors, whether it's going to be Stein or Chivara or Balthasar, sort of in 47, sort of in Wahrheit, you're going to have sort of much the same kind of program sort of enacted. But another way of looking at it is how they deploy idealism against itself. I think it's very interesting that one way sort of to break out sort of the idealist trap is to make a subtle shift, which is a very important shift, and it's the shift sort of from Kant to Hegel or from Husserl back to Hegel. That is a shift from Schein to Erscheinung. That is that actually what you're given in experience is reality. I think that actually is vouchsafed particularly in Chivara and Balthasar, not so much in Stein. That is, Balthasar makes it perfectly plain, and I think he's interpreting Analogia Entis, the book Analogia Entis. It's like, my point of view, Wahrheit is a kind of annotation of what Chivara wrote in 1932. And for him, it's a fairly big distinction. If, in fact, all of the appearances to consciousness are not appearances or show, then, of course, Hegel has corrected Kant, but also that Hegel who has corrected Kant can now be put sort of to Christian and Catholic use. So it's interesting that on the one hand, both Balthasar and Chivara want sort of to, should we say, stymie Hegel, resist Hegel as resist Heidegger. But the way they play it out is that they will use Heidegger to resist something else or someone else. They would use Hegel to resist Husserl, and they'll also use Hegel occasionally to resist Heidegger. One example. In the essence, in, and beyond existence. Think about sort of Jean-Paul Sartre later on, sort of talking about sort of human being as a project, and of course that's based upon Dasein as existence, having no essence, essentially. But what does this say? This actually says sort of that human being sort of is a Bildungsroman. That is, that there's intelligibility and coherence with respect to the growth. Where did that come? The energy sort of is still going to be there insofar as there's going to be perpetual passion of this self-formation. That's the Christian openness to transcendence. But the actual provisional form is Hegelian.
So I suppose what I want to say is that it's not simply a matter of you have phenomenology and then you got Thomas Aquinas. You got Thomas Aquinas sort of as that particular conceptual agent picking up other conceptual agents to tutor and to discipline things which you don't actually agree with. So that's, I suppose, the first question point. The second thing, I think this is the question for both of you. The question for John is, John, you ended beautifully and lyrically and convincingly, and sometimes they don't go together, but you managed all three. But part of the convincingness of it was that you did remind us of what Shivara said. That is, that if we're talking about this as a way, a generous way, an incarnational way, we are not sort of talking sort of about revelation. And therefore, sort of whatever God is given, and whatever properties are assignable to God, those properties sort of are either hypothetical or that might be different than the properties sort of which flow from revelation as such. So in other words, that what you're going to get in Navigare Entis and what you're going to get in Hans-Urs von Balthasar when he's doing something like we call a fundamental theology will not actually be the Trinity. Will not actually be the Trinity. So I take it the way John sort of put it is that if you are doing a Trinitarian theology, he can answer himself, but I take it the point was pretty pointed. It's only on the other side, that is, once revelation has been granted, that a Trinitarian theology as such, whatever about Trinitarian schematics and so forth, a Trinitarian theology as such is only possible on the other side.
Right. Do you want to take the first one?
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, in response to the first one, so I take it that the question is whether Hegel is still floating around, or whether the specter of Hegel to some extent.
No, actually, in this sense, it's not so much, John, that he's around. He's around, and we know he's around, and he's getting resisted. But actually, I'm trying to kind of do the reverse of it. He's around and put to philosophical use against other enemies which need to be stymied at particular points. In other words, it's not simply resisted, but also deployed as he is resisted.
So, as in the transition from Schein to Erscheinung, that, I mean, so, though still, I take it that Erscheinung is not dense enough. It still doesn't get you to the realism that Shivara thinks is required as a balancing to any idealism, that any full philosophy, bracketing even theology for a moment, requires a full-blooded realism on counterpoise to any kind of transcendental idealism. He believed to find that in Schindler initially, really. And he could talk about the resistancy of the real. If Hegel gets you a little bit past Kant, he doesn't really, on his view, succeed. I mean, you're still within the compass of idealism, and you've really only retrieved nature by colonizing it in the name of idealism. So I think Hegel is still there, and he's put to work to some extent, but he's, I think, definitively resisted. And in fact, I think you could say of the two great opponents of the Analogientis are really Hegel and Heidegger, as you and I think, have spoken about many times. Maybe David would want to comment on the first question for himself. But as for the second, I was a little bit wary of that problem. Have I proposed a kind of fundamental theology that has somehow usurped revelation? And I would certainly not want to be seen as doing that. So the image I had there is that we really are brought to the doors of the temple. That we still are within the realm of the profane, the profanum, and that it's only when we cross over the threshold in faith that we can really say that what we have just been talking about applies to the Trinity, and then retrospectively talk about being in consciousness, creaturely being in consciousness as an analog of the Trinitarian life, the triune life. So I would want to be absolutely clear that there is a limit there. There is a threshold, and I do not want reason to go to recklessly run into the Holy of Holies. So if that's one way to, yes. Okay. So anyway, I hope that was an adequate response.
Just briefly, for my part, with respect to the first question, as far as using Hegel against Kant, I mean, I think there's scarcely a better tool for that. I think Hegel's critique of Kant I find just extraordinarily powerful. I mean, in a way, he does it succinctly with the one observation about the boy who essentially is Kant is like the boy who refuses to go into the water until he has learned how to swim. That, in a way, is a devastating critique of Kantianism. But as far as Catholic use, you mentioned Balthasar. The principle, Erscheinung, I mean, the idea is, in fact, that there's nothing in the essence that doesn't appear. That idea comes from Goethe originally. It appears in his poetry. There's nothing external that's not internal. There's nothing internal that's not external. And I think for Balthasar, whom you mentioned, when he says German thinkers have to choose between figures, it's not Kant and Hegel, it's Kant and Goethe, and he chooses Goethe. And I think there's a point to that. One of the implications of that is Goethe's sense of the concrete real. I mean, arguably, you could say Hegel was quite serious about that, but this notion of it's related to the act of existence, and this is a little different from Shivara actually. The excess is not on the side of essence, but on the side of existence. And Balthasar's more mature work, that's something that I think is a very clear resistance to Hegel that would be much closer to Goethe.
All right, we are nearing the end of this session without ever having had to handle an iPad, so I guess my precaution was not necessary. The only thing remaining then is to, of course, once again thank the John Templeton Foundation for making this event possible, to thank the people asking questions, to thank the others in the audience, and last but not least, our panel of speakers.